Welcome to our lecture on Genderlect theory, Genderlect style by Deborah Tannen. This is the first of the gender theories that we're going to cover. Right? We've been kind of dividing this class into sections. Speech codes ethnography leads into this because when we talk about gender within communication, we often talk about it as cultural. And you remember that Genderlect stuff was about, or not the Genderlect stuff, the speech codes theory was about understanding the link between language and culture. And so it's no surprise, right, that there are several theories, like lots of wings of communication discipline, focused on understanding how gender influences communication and how communication influences gender as well. The first of these theories we're going to cover is Deborah Tannen's Genderlect. And this is one of those theories that Deborah Tannen has done quite well for herself. Most of the theories we've covered in here are really primarily like academic theories. But this is a theory that's really received a lot of attention from popular press as well. So, right, like you can find Deborah Tannen books at Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble's, etc., right, like kind of popular literature. Before we go on, it's important that we distinguish the difference between sex and gender. Right? So if we talk about, we're talking about like what the difference is, you can think about it as sex as biological, right? And gender is really the cultural aspect of it. Or if you think the difference between that might be saying like, sex is something that you are, right? And gender is something that you do. Gender is performed. It's something that's constituted by our actions. So there are ways of being a man, or ways of being a woman, or being masculine, being feminine. An analogy that I think matches up pretty well here is if we're going to think about ourselves as like computers, right? Sex would be the hardware, and gender would be the software. Right, and so gender is the programming that goes into what it means to be a man or a woman, and sex would be like the biological hardware that goes into it. Tannen argues that male-female communication is primarily cross-cultural. And what that means is, right, when we talk about communicating across cultures, there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into that. As anyone who's tried to communicate to someone from a different culture knows that there are certain complications, right? Things get lost in translation, different kind of rituals, different understandings, different semiotic meanings of what phrases or words mean, etc. And Tannen says that, right, men and women occupy different kind of cultures, and that every time we communicate with someone from the opposite gender, or someone who is more masculine or feminine than us, we're engaging in cross-cultural communication. Those same type of obstacles exist. Now the problem is, she says that that's fine, but most people don't realize they're engaging in cross-cultural communication when they communicate to people of the opposite gender. Most people tend to think we're talking to someone who shares our culture. And Tannen says that is a problem because we end up not understanding that what the problem of the mistranslations are, right? Like why we have different reference for words, different rituals that constitute meaning, etc. And so what she's trying to do is to help us better understand how it is that we speak in culture. She says that men and women basically speak different languages. And if we don't realize we're speaking different languages, we don't put in the necessary work to make sure that we communicate with each other effectively and efficiently. Now, Tannen argues that, right, men and women speak different language, or we could say masculine and feminine styles of communication. And she argues that they're both equally valued, that we should not privilege one over the other. Did that. Now this is different from a lot of feminist scholarship and some of the theories we're going to be covering coming up here where, one second, let me get that, sorry about that. So this departs from much of feminist scholarship which really focuses on how women's voices are silenced by men. Tannen says that no. Tannen thinks that they're both there and they're both equal, and that this is a problem that a lot of feminists have with Tannen's work. She says they say that she doesn't adequately account for the ways that power influences the way that masculine and feminine styles of communication interact with each other. So Tannen says we should instead think of them kind of as two distinct ways of talking rather than assuming one is superior, right? So she would say that, right, we think about like speaking English and speaking Spanish, right? It's not that one is better, they're just two different ways of talking. It's not as if one is superior. So if women are speaking different kind of languages, right, and we've talked about throughout the course of this course the ways that language is ideological, right, that language has embedded winners and losers within it. And what we need to sort out, according to Tannen, is what these different languages want. What are they geared toward? What are these cultures, right? People form cultures together to try to achieve certain kind of ends. And so what is it that masculine and feminine styles of communication are looking for when they communicate with each other? Tannen says that there's a very distinct breakdown. That women in general, right, seek connection through the ways that they tend to communicate. Whereas, she said, men are more concerned with status when they communicate. Status being, right, like who's higher on the totem pole. And so what we can ask is, right, what kind of communication habits do men and women use that lead us to believe that this is the primary goal in the way that they communicate? And Tannen provides us with several of them here. She calls this rapport talk versus report talk. Rapport talk, right, if you build rapport with someone, it's building a connection, right, like establishing some sort of like meaning between a person, right? And report is about like talking about facts, right? It's a colder, more logical perhaps way of talking. And so rapport versus report talk, Tannen is saying like the rapport talk is obviously a feminine style of communication, and report talk is a masculine style of communication. And report talk is geared primarily towards status. So this is the main breakdown of how it works. And this exhibits itself in certain kind of ways. The first is Tannen draws a distinction between public and private speaking. She says that women tend to talk more in private conversations than men. By private, we mean like, quote, in the home, for example, right? And we think about the kind of things that we tend to talk about in the home, right? They tend to be relationship type of things, or about other people, right? So when you sit down at the end of the day with your significant other, right, like you talk about things that are generally about connection, which is why Tannen says feminine styles of communication are more readily accepted and work better in those private conversations. Where publicly, masculine styles of communication are privileged in the public sphere. And so men and masculine styles of communication tend to work better in the public sphere. So we think about the style of conversation in the public versus the private, for example. In the home, if you're engaged in private talk, right, there's lots of give and take. It's dialogic. Whereas in the public sphere, it's really a monologic style of communication that's privileged. It's more report. It's about, right, like achieving things. It's about doing something. It's about saying what something is rather than building connections with people. And so that monologic style is more suited for public communication. And Tannen says it's the first example, right? In private, we tend to try to establish connections, whereby in public, we're trying to get things done and it's very status driven. Think about the people who are able to speak in monologic styles in public settings. They are people with power. People have some reason to be there. And that is primarily a status question. And she says, why masculine forms of communication are used there. Now, that's not to say women don't speak in public, right? Or men don't speak in private. But, for example, when we think about women, those who are able to assert influence in the public sphere, they have to adopt a masculine style of communication. And so when we see someone, like I think the classic example here is someone like Hillary Clinton, right? Who has done tremendous work in asserting herself in the public dialogue. And right, the kind of things she gets called, for example, because, first of all, she engages in a very masculine style of communication, and it rubs a lot of people the wrong way, right? She gets called a bitch a lot, for example. There's an example of a woman adopting a masculine style of communication for the public sphere, but then her gender maybe challenges that a little bit as well. Storytelling is another way that men and women tend to be quite different in the way that they talk, right? Men tell more jokes than women, according to Tannen, because she said that jokes are primarily about status. With jokes kind of have a one-up kind of quality to them. And so, right, like wherever you're in a setting with a group of men, what happens quite often is someone tells a joke and someone says, I can top that, right? I have a 4-year-old son, and he already does this, right? When I say something, he'll say, I have something fun here, right? It's kind of embedded in us at a very early age. She said also that when men tend to tell stories, they tend to make themselves the heroes in their stories. It's about the crazy thing that they did, right? Or how big that fish they caught was, right? To go to a pretty stereotype there. But when women tell stories, it tends to be about other people, which emphasizes connectivity. And they tend to not make themselves the heroes in that story. All right, we're at 10 minutes. I'll be right back.